Hello, all. I am back, Mommy Melusine, with the Merwomanist podcast. And I want to keep this quick today because, like I said, I record in my closet and it's hot. Between the closet and the head wrap, I'm hot. But the locks haven't been retwisted and I want to do video version of this as well. So I'm making do. I want to move really quickly. I feel like in my first episode, I did not talk about my name, like how I came up with my Mersona. In the mermaid community. We call the sort of characters or personalities we take on and perform are Mersonas. So I realized that I didn't talk about my Mersona. And I thought that talking a little bit about my mermaid journey and my Mersona would actually be a good way to start getting into some lore about Mami Wata, as well as the Melusine story that inspires my Mersona. I'm not going to go too deep. Mami Wata is a really, really complex topic. And truthfully, even as someone who considers myself an expert in this area of Black mermaids, I am still struggling to get a grasp on Mami Wata. I don't think she's meant to be grasped, but I'm going to do a little bit, but I definitely plan an episode where I'm going to do a deeper dive and really do some citing of sources. And there will also be some resources for in the show notes for the episode today. So I want to talk about my mermaid journey and how I came into mermaiding. For anyone who doesn't know, I feel like a lot of people listening to this already know, but for anyone who doesn't know, mermaiding is a sport and an art form, a performance form in which people take on the characters and perform as mermaids. Usually when I'm talking about mermaiding, I'm thinking about people who swim as mermaids, but not all people who perform as mermaids are swimming mermaids, right? There we have dry land mermaids. Right now, I'm a little bit of a dry land mermaid. I do swim, but I'm still working on it. So there is monofin swimming where you actually swim with and I have some of my monofins and my tail skins behind me, where you actually swim with the monofin that holds your feet together and a tail skin so that you actually, mimic the look of a real mermaid. And you use a dolphin kick in order to execute this swim. And professional mermaids do a variety of events. They perform at birthday parties, they perform in aquariums. A lot of professional mermaids do ocean conservation and other kind of activist work. And within the Black mermaid community, I've been excited to see a lot of the mermaids really delving into African water spirits, African diasporic water spirits, and really thinking about Black history and Black people's relationships to water, Black people's relationships to healing trauma, the cultural richness of Black spirituality and lore, really making that a part of their mermaiding practice. And I would definitely put myself in the company of the mermaids who are doing that. So I first became aware of mermaiding as a thing that people could do. I couldn't tell you the year. It was pre-pandemic. Everything's a little bit of a blur pre-pandemic. I want to say it's maybe around 2017 or so. I think I had finished my PhD and I finished my PhD in 2017. And I don't know, maybe I shouldn't tell the internet this, but I used to pole dance, and the studio where I trained, a few of the women at the studio were also mermaids. And I remember one night, a couple of people brought in their new tails to try on in the studio. And I was just like, what is this? What is this thing? And at that time, I still just thought, oh, they're like putting it on and laying down on the beach. Like I didn't realize this was actually something people did in the water until I saw video of one of my pole teachers I need to see if she wants me to shout her out on this. I'll check on that. But I saw a video of one of my pole teachers actually swimming in Hawaii. And if I would have been in that water and she would have passed by me, I would have just completely freaked out because I would have thought it was a real mermaid. That's how convincing it looked. So at that point, I was inspired, but that's when I could not swim at all. I had tried so many times throughout my life to learn how to swim. My husband actually, I call my husband the merman. Like he's the true mer of this household. He swims in the ocean. He swims with flippers. He loves the ocean. And I had asked him to teach me several times and it just never worked. I had a near drowning experience as a child. Maybe I'll tell that story in another episode. And, there's just, I keep using the word trauma, but there's some trauma there around water. And every time someone tried to teach me how to swim, the first step they would try to teach me was to float. And I could never do it because I couldn't relax. And I just came to the conclusion that I can't swim because I can't float. My body doesn't float, which is not true, which I've learned is not true, but that's what I thought. So at that time, I was inspired, but I also just didn't believe this was something I could ever do because swimming just didn't seem to be in the cards for me. 2018 I think it was 2018 when the show Siren came out, right? I'm sure there's some fans of that show who are listening to this, and that's definitely something I want to talk about if you in a future episode. But the very first mermaid on screen in Siren was a Black mermaid. So this is when I actually remember actually starting to write about mermaids. I started writing a piece about Siren that I actually have never finished and published. So that's something I probably need to go back to. But there's just a lot of interesting things going on in that show. Even though I think the show was really attempting to be colorblind, there was still some stuff happening with race and Blackness and indigeneity and sexuality that was really fascinating to me. So at the time, I was teaching a course called Gender and Sexuality in Science Fiction at Cal State LA, and I created a mermaids unit in that course. And in that unit, we looked at things like Beyonce's Lemonade, because Beyonce was really channeling Oshun through, and as well as other African deities through, and African diasporic deities throughout that album and some of the performances that went along with it. So we watched the video Hold Up, which is when she really channels Oshun. And then that's something, again, I'll talk about in another episode going into detail about Beyonce's mermaid life. But we looked at that. We looked at episodes of Siren. We read pieces of Nana Hopkinson's New Moon's Arms. And I just really, I think at that point I knew I kind of had something, but for some reason I was still resisting making that my project. At the time, my dissertation had been about Black women's science fiction, Black cultural politics and gender in Black women's science fiction, a lot of stuff on Octavia Butler and some other authors. And that's what I was working on at that time. So 2020, pandemic, pandemic shut down, quarantine. I was really stressed out, as I know a lot of people were. I have a very young child, so I was stuck in this apartment with this really young child. At that time, even the playgrounds were shut down. So it was just a really difficult time. And one of the things I started doing for stress relief was watching professional mermaid videos, watching people swim. And I don't know, it was just so calming. It was just like the magic of it, the mystery of it, the peacefulness, the quiet. There was just something really powerful about it. Of course, all of the mermaids that I was seeing were white. And it wasn't until I came across Mermaid Shay Monique being interviewed on one of the mermaids channels that I saw a Black mermaid who was doing this. And I think that's when I became determined that this was something that I wanted to do. So I finally just signed up for professional swim lessons. And this was something I finally had time to do because of quarantine. Shout out to Conrad Cooper, Swim to Me, who taught, this is a Black man who I think probably taught a lot of the Black people in LA how to swim. So shout out to Conrad. But I took lessons with Conrad. He did not start with floating. He taught us how to swim first, and then we learned how to float and tread. And I realized I can do this. I can do all of this. So I think it was probably a few months into the swimming journey that I decided. I had started following different mermaids on Instagram. So I think Mermaid Chez Monique was the first one I found. I found the Caribbean Pearl, shout out to Caribbean Pearl. I found Mermaid Maui. I found Carrie Wata, shout out to Carrie Wata, Afro Mermaid and the Afro Mermaid Convention. You know, she was one of the first ones I found. And what was unique about Carrie Wata is she is one of the first ones I found who I saw, and she wasn't the last, but she was the first who I saw was really specifically and explicitly connecting her Mersona to African diasporic lore, which by that time I was studying in my research, and I really wanted my Mersona to reflect that as well. So I went through a lot of different ideas. One of the first names I came up with was Indigo Siren. Indigo is that name just has a whole history with me and my husband. That's what we wanted to name a daughter if we had one. And it represents a lot, thinking about enslavement and people who were enslaved in the indigo fields, their hands carried the stains. One of my favorite films was Daughters of the Dust, and that was something that that film talked about. So to me, indigo represented memory and history, and I wanted something that really connected to Black history. And then, Siren, because the mermaid stories that had always been some of my favorites were the siren stories, right? The ones where they were dangerous and powerful and predatory. But then I found that there was already somebody with that name. So shout out to Indigo Siren, who is a really, really beautiful mermaid and multi-talented artist. And I'm going to put all these people I'm shouting out in the show notes as well. So somebody already had that name. I thought about Jalandra Wata, but I was like, I don't want to seem like I'm biting on Carrie Wata. So then I thought about Mami, right? Like, oh, well, maybe I'll do Mami Jalandra, but I was like, oh, that sounds like something my kid will call me. And so I decided on Mami Melusine because of what the Melusine story, the ways in which I had always connected to that story and connected to it even more now that I was a wife and mother. So I talked about the Melusine story a little bit in the last episode. I'm going to come back to that at the end of this one, but I want to briefly talk about Mami Wata. So in order to talk about Mami Wata, got to talk about what African traditional religions, ATRs. African traditional religions are the religions that were practiced in the regions throughout Africa prior to, during, and still continue to be practiced after Islamic and Christian conquest and conversion. I actually, in my work, when I write about these religions, I like to call them African indigenous religions, because I think sometimes when I hear the word traditional, or when people hear the word traditional, we think not changing, we think static, right? And static, something that's static is something that doesn't move. And these African indigenous religions are actually very adaptable. They're very flexible. They're very porous. And what I mean by that is they're capable of taking in, they are capable of maintaining their original character, but also taking in and exchanging influences within each other, as well as with other religions throughout the world. So I like to call them African indigenous religions. African indigenous religions, a lot of scholars will describe them as something that we call animist religions. And what that means is that these are religions in which there are lots of different forces, in which there is life force and energy in everything, right? Every, spirit, every person, every animal, every plant, even inert matter, everything has energy. And that energy can be these things can be manipulated in the material world in order to impact the things that happen in the spiritual world. And the spiritual world in turn impacts the material world, and they're all connected. Um, this is so hard to try to explain quickly, but I'm going to be coming back to talking about African indigenous religions as well as African diasporic religions again and again throughout this podcast. So, in many of these religions, there is a concept of a supreme God, like one supreme God. So, some people will still call these religions monotheistic, even though there's actually a lot of deities and different forces in some of them. But there is a concept of a supreme God. In many of these religions, that supreme God has somewhat withdrawn from the world and isn't in as sort of direct intervention with human affairs. So the beings that kind of really manage things are more intermediary deities. And in some African indigenous religions, as well as diasporic religions, we don't like to refer to these deities necessarily as gods and goddesses, because there is the acknowledgement that there is a supreme God that is all powerful. So I try, even though sometimes I'll say goddess, sometimes I'll slip and say it, but I usually try to use words like deity, spirits, divinities. So these different intermediary deities or forces are embodiments of natural elements, and they're associated with places, and places in nature. So oceans, streams, mountains, rivers, lakes. So of course, many of these are water deities or water spirits, right? And so Mami Wata is, on one hand, she is one of these water spirits. On the other hand, she's kind of an embodiment of a lot of them. What a lot of scholars believe is that Mami Wata comes out of a fusion of lots of Central and West African water spirits with the external influences from Europe as well as India throughout the transatlantic slave trade and conquest. I hope I'm still making sense. I'm sleepy. It's the end of the night. This closet is hot. So I hope I'm still making sense. So basically, what scholars argue is that Mami Wata is a modern deity, that she comes out of the contact between Africans and Europeans, as well as other cultures that were present on the continent during the years of conquest, so the late 19th, early 20th century. This is something that is a bit contested, right? So what scholars argue is that the name Mami Wata is Pidgin English for mother water. So it comes out of the language that African peoples and European peoples kind of developed to be able to talk to each other. So that is Pidgin English for mother water, and it's used to refer to lots of different spirits and deities that have been kind of taken up and absorbed into Mami Wata lore. So Mami Wata is referred to both as a really specific singular goddess with these specific characteristics, but the name Mami Wata or the term Mami Wata is also used to refer to a multitude of water spirits. Now, this is something so one of the caveats that I want to name here, or one of the things that I want to sort of talk about how I enter this, is I enter this primarily as a scholar. I'll talk about my own spiritual journey some other time, but I primarily enter this conversation as a scholar, and that's most of the material I'm engaging with. But this perspective on Mami Wata is not necessarily shared by people who actually are devotees of Mami Wata, right? So one of the things that I'm trying to do is branch out kind of beyond the scholarly material to read the work of priestesses and devotees and people who are actually within Mami Wata faith. And for many of these people, what I gather is that Mami Watts has always existed. Some of them will say she's always existed under that name. And some wouldn't, but that she's an ancient primordial force of the water. In Afrofuturism, the world of Black sci-fi and fantasy culture, Watasha Womack suggests that the name Mami Wata actually comes out of ancient Egyptian words for Mami meaning truth and Ati meaning ocean water, right? So some people even reject the idea that that the name Mami Wata comes out of this sort of pidgin English dialect. So I'm not going to take a position on this within this podcast. I do have some thoughts about it. I think that multiple things can be true at once. And that is something that if you're someone who studies or practices or is exploring African indigenous religions, you have to learn to accept that multiple things can be true at the same time. Because these religions are they're just able to articulate a really complex view of the world in which there are lots of different forces with lots of different dimensions to them and different ways that they can be expressed. So Mami Wata can be a benevolent mother. She can be a destroyer, right? She can kidnap you into the water and you can never be seen again. Or she can take you and give you great knowledge and great wisdom. And when you come back, you are better and wiser. She can bring floods. She can bring fortune. She can give fertility. She can take it away. Right? There's all of these different dimensions to this being. And a mermaid is only one of the potential forms that Mami Wata can take. It's only one of her avatars. Actually, a lot of the physical representations of Mami Wata would be not with a fish tail, but with a serpent tail, and she is often associated with serpents. She's often depicted with snakes winding around her neck, her arms, and her waist. And so Watasha Womack, again, potentially traces some of this iconography back to the goddess Isis of ancient Egypt, who was a river goddess, the goddess of the river Nile, who was also associated with serpents. However, serpents are sacred to a lot of indigenous African cultures. So I think that there are many directions from which this association can come. So I'm going to talk more about Mami Wata. I'm going to do a whole episode on Mami Wata, but it's just complex. It's really fascinating. There are regions in which Mami Wata is more of a deity, with devotees, with structures around honoring her, being initiated into Mami Wata practice. However, there are other areas where Mami Wata is more lore. Like more sort of oral lore and more legend. People believe in Mami Watas, but not necessarily a goddess in the same way. So for example, there is an anthropologist whose work I was writing about Mami Wata in the Congo. And I will find that article and put it in the notes. But in the Congo, Mami Wata is a term that's used to refer to a multitude of water spirits, but also used to refer to very beautiful women who know how to get what they want, right? So, a Mami Wata is, a Mami Wata, she tends to like nice shit. They're often associated with money. Right. So if someone suddenly has like a lot of money, people might say, oh, he must have a Mami Wata. And they can, they can be dangerous, they can be very dangerous as well. So when I write about Mami Wata, I kind of have sort of two distinctions. I have the capital letter Mami Wata when I'm really talking about the goddess or the name that is given to a multitude of goddesses and water spirits that people are actual devotees to, and the more lowercase Mami Wata that can be used to describe a lot of different water beings and spirits. So in me taking on Mami as part of my Mersona, I'm lowercase, like I'm lowercase. I'm not trying to say that I am a manifestation of this goddess. I do not want that smoke. So even though I enter these conversations primarily as a scholar, I do believe in these spirits and these energies. I am not an initiate, I'm not a devotee. But I do, I believe in the reality of these energies and I don't want to insult them. So I so when I think about a Mami Wata, it can be used to refer to a bunch of spirits. Actually, sometimes Africans would call sea mammals like manatees, seals, dugongs, they will call them Mami Watas as well. Right. So that's kind of an interesting connection too. If we think about what I was talking about last episode with the Selkies, that there's also this connection with seals and sea mammals that also happens in African diasporic mermaid lore. So I wanted to have some connection to African diasporic mermaids. So that's why I took on Mami. And the second part is Melusine. I told the Melusine story last episode, but I just want to reiterate it a little bit in order to talk about how this idea of the Melusine connects to my brand. So first of all, the Melusine, I do not think that the original version of this story is what scholars tell us, which is that it comes out of France. I first remember reading a version of this story in 1001 Nights, which is a compilation of tales that a compilation of tales from the ancient Islamic world. And it was one of the, so 1001 Nights is basically, it's like a frame. It's a really, really long book and it's a frame story. There's a young woman, and I actually have never heard this name said. I've read this name, but never heard it said out loud. So I might butcher it. Scheherazade? I'm going to look it up, but I'll put her name in the notes. But she's a young woman in this kingdom where there is a king who is so furious because one of his wives betrayed him and cheated on him that he marries a new wife every day and executes them in the morning as revenge. So Scheherazade is this legendary storyteller in her community. So she asked her parents to basically present her to the king as a wife. And because she wants to stop this cycle of executing these innocent women. So what she devises is that she starts telling him a story every night, but does not tell him the end. She doesn't tell him the end of the story. So he agrees to keep her alive another day so he can hear the end of the story, but the end of that story always leads into the beginning of a new story. So then he keeps her alive another day. So she just manages to keep telling stories so that he keeps her alive long enough that he falls in love with her and decides not to execute her anyway. I know it's terrible. It's absolutely terrible. But I love the I love that frame story because, I think of myself as a storyteller. And so I really love that frame story. But in 1001 Nights, there was a story about a king who married a woman who told him not to look at her one day a week while she took her bath alone. And if he ever looked at her, she would immediately have to leave him. So he respects it for a while, but then, people are getting in his ear telling him that she might be cheating on him. So he decides to look, and he sees that from the waist down, she is a serpent. And the second that he sees her, she flees out of the window. And then it leads into a new story. So I remember reading this in 1001 Nights. But this tale is often is more often described as the story of Melusine or Melusina, which is a story that comes out of, oh, I'm trying to think of the time period. I want to say somewhere in medieval France. And so it's a little bit more complicated. Melusina's like the daughter of this other fairy, but basically it's the same structure. A king marries this beautiful woman. She is really brings a lot of good fortune to his kingdom. She builds him magnificent castles. She bears him 10 children. I believe they're all sons. All of the children, they'll have some kind of, little I don't want to say deformity. They all have something that is non-normative about their appearance. And that is the thing that sort of indicates that she is not fully human herself. And like in the Arabian Nights, 1001 Tales is sometimes called Arabian Nights. Like in that story, the king, people start getting in his ear and telling him that she might be unfaithful. And he violates their promise and he looks in on her. At some point, she finds out about it and she, flees back to the sea. And in some versions, she actually turns into a dragon and flees, right? But in, the things about these kind of stories is they get retold again and again. Like in the Middle Ages, in the early modern period in Europe, plagiarism wasn't really like a thing. you know, it just wasn't a thing. People just, like when we look at most of Shakespeare's plays, they're all, a lot of them are stories that already existed, were already written. People would just rewrite the same tale again and again. So there are a lot of different iterations of this story. And, we are coming more and more to think of the Melusine as a mermaid. And she is sometimes depicted, with a double mermaid tail, though she, in the past have been depicted with a serpent tail or as a dragon or something like that. So why do I identify with this story? I'm a wife and I am a mother. And I look at this Melusine story as being about boundaries and self-care and autonomy. Just having space and time that is just for you and not allowing anyone to violate that. Right. So when I use Melusine as a hashtag, I'm usually using it when I'm posting about something I'm doing that is just very much for me. When I'm taking dance classes, one of the things I really like doing is I like arranging flowers. I like making centerpieces. And I mean, I'm typically doing this for someone else, like I'm doing it for some kind of event or something, but it's something that I offer to do for people because it's something I enjoy and something that brings me joy. So, that's where the Melusine comes from. And so putting them together is my way of kind of connecting my desire to, just spread the word and teach people about African diasporic mermaid lore, but also to express my love for the kind of mermaid lore that I also am invested in, right? There's also Western mermaid lore that I also really appreciate and love. So that's my Mersona. So for me, one of the things that as I'm going through this swimming journey, and it's been a little bit rocky. So I went to the Afro Mermaid Convention in June of this year, and I had a really wonderful time. But one of the things that, made me a little bit sad is that I wasn't as proficient in the water as I thought I was. you know I was I'm just not ready. I'm not ready to just really be out there with the other mermaids the way I would love to. And so one of the things I've been thinking about since I've gotten back in terms of what I really want to do with this mermaid journey, and I'm like, I'm just really going to lean into my things. I mean, the swimming will come, I don't ever really want to do, yeah, I don't want to do birthday parties. I don't want to do aquariums. Like, I'm not really trying to do that. I would like to feel more comfortable and more at peace in the water. Um, so that's something that I'm working towards. But I'm just going to lean into what it is that I do well. And what I do well is think and research and write about mermaids. And I dance and I make art and I make beautiful things, and I advocate for women to try to craft lives for ourselves within this exploitative capitalist world. Try to carve space that is just for us, a space that is for our own peace and for our own joy. And that is part of what this mermaid journey represents for me. So I'm going to go ahead and close it out here. I'm very new to this whole podcasting thing. So I know I'm supposed to tell you stuff at the end. So the Merwomanist podcast is available on Anchor, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, pretty much anywhere that podcasts are held. I'm pretty sure it's available. Please make sure that you subscribe. Please make sure that you rate. I would love 5 stars. So that this podcast can be located when people search for mermaid podcasts so that they can hear about our African diasporic mermaid life. So I'm going to close that out here. Bye.